Welcome to Relearning Leadership. I'm your host, Pete Behrens. In our last episode, we talked about disruption, the kind of forces shaping and perhaps reshaping the global supply chain, geopolitical risks, decarbonization, the pace of AI. And the argument I made is that the forces aren't fixed through better planning. They're demanding a new type of leadership, a different kind of leadership, catalyst leadership, which leads to possibly the next common question I get. What does that actually look like inside a real company with real pressures, real politics, real quarterly targets? That's where today's episode comes in. I sat down with Paul Stonehouse. Paul works inside Schneider Electric, about 160,000 people globally, one of the biggest players in electrical distribution and energy management today. Now, Paul isn't coming in from the outside running a transformation program. He is one of their employees working to shape the culture from the inside. What I didn't expect is how vivid Paul is. Paul thinks in pictures. He describes culture as like a reef, as if you're a fish swimming in the water every day and not even noticing the water until somebody asks you, how's the water? He imagines empowerment as if you are blindfolded in a field with an electric fence and any wrong move, zap. So what do you learn? Well, maybe the best strategy isn't to move at all. Not so great. And then there's the image of the flower, which I'll tease up for you to listen for in our conversation. So without further ado, my conversation with Paul Stonehouse. Thanks for joining me today. This is a really interesting point to maybe reflect and plan. Maybe just give us a picture of who Schneider Electric is and this global supply chain group that you work with.
Okay. So Schneider Electric, one of the global leaders in electrical distribution, from everything from a very small breaker or light switch all the way up to applications on the cloud and control systems. I think it's around 150, 160,000 people globally. Global supply chain is around 50, 60% of that. One of the big things that we have now for Schneider Electric is that with the decarbonization efforts and the increase in electrical usage, this is a big growth factor for us. One of the other things that we have now is just the complexity and interdependence of a lot of our supply chain. You have local regulations, you have government and geopolitical risks. As we're speaking right now, there's wars going on and there's wars starting, which is creating supply chain risks. So we've built a lot of capabilities that allow us to deal with these changes. We have an end-to-end control tower which helps visualize this. But what we're noticing as well is that as you go into these problems with decarbonization, as you go into electrification, in addition with the augmentation on demand and data centers and AI, all of these things are meaning that there's a huge amount of interdependence and flows, which means that we need to be more resilient. And resiliency means that we need to have people who understand better, who are able to sense the problems and detect them quicker. This combined finally with the speed of change and the rate of change in the markets means that our ability to be resilient and respond to change more effectively is the driving factors right now for Schneider Electric.
So big company, big problems. One of the things that you described there is disruption. And I think if there's a common trend of why agility is necessary globally today, it feels like disruptions are increasing globally, whether that's climate, geopolitical, social, technology. When we first came into Schneider, I think it was a couple years ago now, we took a snapshot of your culture and we brought it to some of your senior leaders and it provided an interesting view. And I'm wondering if you'd describe that in your terms. What resonated with the senior leaders?
I think one of the things that we see is that as a culture is a macro mega thing that you encounter day to day. Like one of the visualizations I always think of is like a small fish in a reef. You're going in and out every day and you're living on the reef and you don't realize until someone asks, how's the water? That you've been swimming the whole time. And so what this did is this asked everyone to stop and say, how's the water? Was the water toxic? How's the visibility? And I think the cultural values framework was the first time when everyone knew what it was, but it helped create that discussion point to say, this is where we are, this is where people want to be. And more importantly, there's a collectiveness to it. It's that idea of shining a light on a problem. Once you shine the light on it, you can't stop looking at it. We now know that we need to clean up the reef together, and it's visible.
Interesting. I always love your stories of metaphors and pictures, imagery of description. One of the things you're describing is a shared language, which we find to be incredibly valuable for leadership alignment. The other thing is focus. We often call this a North Star. It doesn't tell you what to do, it just points in a direction of where we can get better. And one of the things I heard from your senior leadership team is your cultural map indicated very driven culture. What problems were you seeing in that over-reliance on a control-compete culture?
One of the things we talk a lot about is how do we start to break the silos, or I tried to say, before we break them, let's try to bridge them first. Because silos are important because they bring efficiency, but bridging them allows us to go horizontally to deliver value. And I think one of the things that's really important is that it allows us to still manage this top-down culture, because we still need to have hierarchy in such a large company. But at the same time, how do we have this sort of dual operating model where we can see things horizontally and top-down? So it's more about shifting and adapting rather than doing a cultural transformation.
Interesting. We call this tweak the system versus open heart surgery. And that leads us to our next stage. So as we work with leadership teams through the change process, we work in two dimensions. There's one dimension, which is mindset, which is working with leaders on a new way of thinking and new way of behaving. We call that the microculture journey. We'd get hundreds of leaders, thousands of leaders starting to change. It changes culture. Today, in this session, we're going to focus a little bit more on the macro journey, the macro culture, the macro levers. Let's talk a little bit about these levers and what are you seeing?
The really nice thing about this bottom half of the compass and focusing on the culture is it aligns with what you said. It's about getting business results.
Okay.
And at the end of the day, we need to get those results. Now it's how do you shift the experience internally to start to shift these things? I was working with one leader, and during a workshop they were mentioning that this is the first time in their career in Schneider, and that they're senior leaders, so they've been here quite a long time. It's the first time in their career that they actually have fewer KPIs to deliver. And we're trying to delineate between targets and indicators, and making sure that indicators, we still need them because they maintain the health of the system, and in the event something goes wrong, they help us roll that back. But the idea of trying to reduce the number of targets and moving that to an indicator because we want to know the health, we don't necessarily need to drive siloed behavior. Going back to my topic of silos is sometimes these KPIs that become targets, they create that siloed behavior. And that's part of the interesting thing is that as we talk about growth mindset as a culture, how can I make sure that my planning department's talking to my logistics department, that's talking to my supply chain department, that's talking to procurement? How do we start to create this horizontal view?
I think you're bringing up a really interesting point. We often talk about policies and metrics.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference we talk about is metrics are really just data points.
Mm-hmm.
Policies are governance around some of those. And what you're indicating here is a tendency is to take anything we measure mm-hmm. and it becomes a KPI or a target, as you say, which in a sense is adding governance to it. It's putting pressure on that, on the indicator. What you're talking about here is a really interesting one, which is what are the ones we really want to focus on that are going to be driving certain behaviors? And when we pick too many, that becomes a problem itself. I just wanted to pause on that one and have you reflect on it.
Yeah, just another visualization is I've got this silly watch. I used to get stressed out about my sleep score, so I wouldn't get a good night's sleep. So it's exactly that. I have another KPI for my health, but it's actually causing a detriment in your health. In France, we have this word called infobesity. This idea that we're just overwhelmed with information.
Okay.
And we have too much of it, so we're obese with the amount of information we have.
I like the term.
And I stole this idea from Russell Ackoff. He had this idea that there's data, information, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, the value chain. The data and the information has become very commoditized. So the information age and digitization has made this easier and easier to come to. So that's why we have so much information, is that it's easy to produce. Now we go up to the next level of understanding. AI is making this a commodity. It's very quickly going to commoditize all the knowledge work that we have. So now we're going to focus on understanding and wisdom. And I think understanding and wisdom requires a lot more involvement of people, understanding people, making sure they understand system thinking and network effects. And I think that's where the agile leadership journey and understanding where our culture is, it allows you to focus less on getting more data points, less on getting more information and going more towards wisdom. And I think that's the global aspiration for the company, is that we're going to move more towards wisdom and having people being more effective rather than focusing on the commoditization that AI and the information age has brought us.
Awesome.
I had 3 leaders and they followed the idea of the 3 amigos. One was focused on more delivering projects, one was focused more on the IT, and one was focused more on the data and the data governance side. And what these 3 leaders did is they formed their own squad or league or team, and they started to work together, and they asked, whenever the project team has problems, rather than you coming to us one by one, you're going to come to us together as a collective. And what they reported was not necessarily that the work sped up a lot, but actually they had to make fewer small decisions and fewer low-value decisions about escalations. The escalations were reduced because now the people know that the managers are aligned. If we're going to go bring them a problem, we have to be aligned before we bring it to them. And this small micro-structure change has created a big impact for the team. When I talk to them on a day-to-day basis, they're happier because they know their boundary.
I love that construct, and it reminds me of a similar organization in healthcare where we were doing this, and they developed that leadership council to make decisions at speed. And that is a key thing, to be able to get access to all the key decision makers at the same time, to bring the problem and discuss versus the back and forth that often happens with all these individuals. That's an awesome example. So as we're thinking about change through this system, Schneider's huge, pervasive across different regions, product sets, technology areas. What are some of the biggest challenges you're running into as you're starting to propagate change or try to scale?
If I go back to my first example of us being the fish on the reef, it's very easy to try to outsource the problem. For example, a big consultancy, and basically they're a shark on the reef, and you're going to outsource it and they're going to eat some of your problem, right? But if you keep outsourcing it, for sure they're going to take care of part of your problem, but it's not a systemic change.
You're just scaring everybody else into compliance.
Exactly. It's one of those things where to change at scale, you need lots of small changes. You need all the fish to get together rather than just trying to outsource it and make a transformation program.
Yeah. What I'm taking from this, and bring it back into business, we could come in with change. We don't, because we know that change often isn't native. It's not natural. It doesn't always stick. It can be quick, but not always effective. One of our approaches is to guide leaders to drive change themselves. Get the organization itself the education it needs to drive and manage this just change process. So what I'm hearing, number one, is that's a challenge, but also you're seeing that all people taking ownership and starting to be empowered. Are you seeing any of that? Are you seeing any positive response in terms of leaders taking that?
There's a lot of change in the language, and there's a lot of change in the way that we're talking about the change. Sometimes that leads to that hypocrisy of people saying stuff but not necessarily doing stuff. So if you want, I can share one more about my empowerment story. So I have the story about empowerment is this idea of empowerment is a bit like telling someone that they're empowered by giving them a blindfold and putting them out in a field. So where I live in France, we have lots of fields out here where the cows roam. And so you can imagine that you have this electric wire around the field and you're walking around, but you're blindfolded and you've been told you're empowered and you need to achieve your goals. So of course you walk, and because it's a cow, it's a big beast, these electric wires, they're very powerful, and they give you a good zap. Once they give you the good zap, of course, you stop and you try to go another way. And after a while, your best strategy is just to stop moving. And so your empowerment has led to you going up against the structural electric fence. It's led you going against the metric electric fence. It's led you to go against the policy electric fence because you keep getting slapped for all the things that you've been touching that you didn't know. And I think this idea of empowerment is, how do we make sure that things are visible? How do we know where we are? So we can start removing the blindfold to know where we can change and where we can't. So I think this is one of those ideas. The same with collaboration. One of the things that we've seen from collaboration is when you look at it through the different mindsets of expert, achiever, and catalyst, the idea of collaboration is very different. An expert leader, when they see collaboration, because they're very good at one-on-one, they're going to say, I'm collaborating because Pete and I are talking. The achiever leader is going to say, well, I'm collaborating because I've told them all to get on the bus and we're all going somewhere, so we're collaborating. And the catalyst leader realizes that they have to release the chains and release the reins and release control. And that feels very uncomfortable. To go from that achiever to catalyst, it's a big jump. So I think the language is changing, but it's going back to the idea of how do we know that hypocrisy, it's part of our natural phases of changes in the language, but follow that with the behavior change as well.
What you're indicating is all of the interconnections between the leadership mindset and the structure and policies and metrics tied. And most of these structures, policies, metrics have been built with a mindset in mind. And to try to pull them apart is impossible. And this is why we have both sides of our compass. We talk about the mindset, and if we can't change the mindset, we're not going to be able to change the policies because the policies are a reflection of it. And I think what you're reminding me and reminding why we do what we do is to recognize that in order to get access to these new levers, we've got to start changing the way people are thinking and believing and behaving.
Yeah, and to change at scale, it's that idea of how do we emerge the change. So I don't know if we have time, but I can finish with my final mental model. But if you can imagine for the people that are listening, it's this idea that, I'm trying to plant a flower, and I have this beautiful pot with all the soil inside. I plant my seed. And the idea is that if you water it and take care of it, of course, it's going to start to grow leaves. It's going to start to grow a plant. If I continue to take care of it, it's going to grow this beautiful flower. When you try to do things at scale and when you try to go things very fast, you just see the flower and you try to cut off the flower and put it on your plant. And of course, it dies, right? So the idea is, how do I start with leadership and cultivate the plant towards what I want it to be, rather than just trying to do the open heart surgery where I cut off the flower and put it on my own plant.
We want the end result without the work it takes to get that end result, which is a patience problem. And I think one of the challenges we have with many organizations, and you even talked about it earlier, do we have time to do this kind of change? There's so much disruption going on, so much change happening so quickly. We've got to respond to the market. Do we have time? Isn't it quicker just to have somebody else cultivate the flower? We'll cut it off, we'll put it over here and just use it for a while. And it's interesting because I think this journey, this agile leadership journey, is one that does take time.
Yeah.
Do we have time? Does Schneider have time? I'm putting you on the spot here.
I'll go back to Deming. I think Deming said adaptation isn't mandatory, but neither is survival. It's this idea that if you don't make the time now, maybe you won't have the time later either, because you just won't be around. So for me, being adaptable, hitting our goals, especially as we huge amounts of growth. Resiliency requires a growth mindset, because if you're resilient with a fixed mindset, you're just going to try to do the same old tricks. Resiliency and using anti-fragile patterns means you're going to grow the organization, you're going to grow capability. And with the advent of AI and the commoditization of knowledge work, we have to change. So I think it's a survival instinct. Yeah. And I think my company, I'm in the fortunate position where our back isn't against the wall yet. We're not facing a crisis. Our leaders are very forward-looking, and so I have a lot of energy and optimism for the future.
It's a great message. For those companies that only do this change because their backs are against the wall, it's often fraught. But it's when you can start to do this ahead of that curve, I think that's really critical. The other thing you mentioned, which I think I just want to highlight here, is you're talking about all these little micro results, these little bits of where this project, this leadership team, this group, these silo bridging, these are all micro things. I call this marginal gains. We don't transform overnight. We don't transform in a year or 3 years. We transform because we do a dozen, 2 dozen, 10 dozen micro transformations. And then all of a sudden it looks like this brand new plant. And I think what you're describing is exactly that. All these small little things that are happening that are changing.
Yep. Yeah, it's the idea of emergence. Things are emerging. You try to make things more fractal, and you look at things more as a system rather than a bunch of independent initiatives.
Awesome. Well, I want to say thank you for allowing us to share your story. Anything else you want to add in closing?
Enjoy the journey. One of the quotes I had was, yesterday I was smart, so I tried to change the world. Today I'm wise, so I changed myself. I probably got the quote wrong, but of that nature, it's that idea of start with yourself, start internally, and then try to bring people along for the journey, because doing a journey together is a lot more enjoyable than being alone.
And it's not easy.
No.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
I'm Pete Behrens. Thanks for listening or watching. Relearning Leadership is the official podcast of the Agile Leadership Journey. To learn more, visit relearningleadership.show.
If you enjoyed this episode, it's drawing from one of the dozens of stories in Pete's debut book, Into the Fog, Leadership Stories from the Edge of Uncertainty, available in hardcover, paperback, ebook, and soon-to-be-released audio. Get your copy today from Amazon.